And you're back watching or listening to the Constitution line by line. We have gone all the way through the U.S. Constitution, and we are now into the Bill of Rights, and we are now to the 10th Amendment.
The 10th Amendment.
To the United States Constitution. I'm Don Frazier.
I'm Paul Fabricio. And when I grew up and was learning about the 10th Amendment in the Constitution, I very seldom heard discussion about the 10th Amendment. That was in Southern California.
Sure.
When I moved to Georgia to go to graduate school, and then in Texas, the 10th Amendment comes up all the time.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, the geographic differences of it.
Absolutely not surprising to me as a historian.
And now, if I were back in California, there's great discussion about the 10th Amendment.
Oh, they've discovered it now.
They've discovered the 10th Amendment.
A little late to the party, Cali.
Well, that's the way it goes. Cali? What is this?
California.
I know that.
But
All right.
Cali.
All right. So are you ready?
Yes.
The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people.
States or people.
Yeah, states or people, but the focus on this is really about the states because rights retained by the people were in the 9th Amendment.
Correct.
So the 10th Amendment is really about states' rights, and we're talking about what are reserved powers. So there's powers given to the national government.
And they're pretty much laid out.
And they're laid out there, enumerated.
With a couple of little stretchy parts
Yes,
for necessary and proper and things like that.
Yes. And then the 10th Amendment, they just said, okay, there's a couple powers reserved for the states. You get them.
There's some stuff that we know about, but we just don't care about.
Exactly.
The states get to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And did they give us a listing of what these powers are?
Heavens no.
No, not at all.
But that becomes the idea of state prerogative on certain laws.
Yes. So, Don, states' rights, 10th Amendment.
It's huge. And
it's
one of the things that ended up becoming a state prerogative, and it became a state prerogative because the states that brought it into the Constitution already recognized it as a prerogative, included slavery.
Yes.
And I know some of the listeners think that we're a little heavy on the slavery issue, but it was the central issue to the guys that were meeting in that hall.
And it was the
central
issue for 100 and, well, let's be honest, it
still
is an issue in the presidential election.
So, all the way to about 8 o'clock this morning and beyond. So, the idea behind state prerogative means that there's stuff that the federal government just doesn't have jurisdiction over, and the states do. So, with slavery, slavery was legal in all of the original states, but then it is rapidly shed by northern states and retained by southern states as being a state prerogative. Therefore, Southerners believed the federal government had no jurisdiction over slavery.
Right.
All right. Some would believe today that the federal government has no jurisdiction over things like abortion rights.
Right.
So it's not
and also over questions of race in terms of how that plays out, in terms of religion, in terms of discrimination, in terms of sexual identity. There's a whole host of things.
But 14th and 15th Amendment are going to incorporate a bunch of that stuff. So we're going to talk about that later. But I'm just giving you the run-up to the American Civil War. And a lot of people say, well, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. Well, let's talk about how the 10th Amendment actually is the nexus for this argument. So, states believed that they had the right to enslave people.
Yes.
And slavery followed the mother. So, if your mother was a slave, then you're a slave. So that guarantees that slavery will be perpetual. And it will be perpetuated as a state prerogative until it's not. So when the federal government starts getting pressure to try to eliminate slavery, states are all saying, well, we have a right to it because these are powers reserved to the states. So the federal government, members of the federal government said, well, there are jurisdictions that the federal government has where we can start to crimp slavery.
Okay.
For instance, the federal government has jurisdiction over the high seas.
Okay.
So if you're buying slaves from Virginia and moving them to Louisiana, well, the federal government could theoretically say, we're going to just make this rule that you can't transport slaves by water.
Okay. And also the federal government in the Constitution itself banned the slave trade.
Well, that's from Africa. So
Right.
this isn't the internal slave trade.
Right.
So the internal slave trade is just a transaction for property.
Mm-hmm.
But the federal government could then start, theoretically, imposing limits on what species of property could be carried in boats in international waters or even national territorial waters outside of the state limits. So there's ways that you can start interfering with slavery without abolishing slavery. Today we see that with certain undesirable industries, like, say, the coal industry. You can try to regulate the coal industry through federal regulations out of existence where it's just no longer profitable to maintain it. So Southerners were afraid that the federal government was going to use its ability to regulate certain aspects of commerce to make slavery no longer economically viable.
Okay.
So if slavery can't expand, for instance, into the territories, then what you end up having is too many slaves. You know, there's a certain optimal point where slavery is efficient, and slaves are actually producing enough in order to essentially maintain their own upkeep.
Okay.
But there could come a time when you had too many slaves on your plantation, and if you couldn't move them, couldn't sell them, the value of those slaves went down, the cost of their care and upkeep went up, and then there's the additional problem of most of these states had anti-manumission laws.
And you'll explain what that is?
That means you can't just turn your slaves loose once you're done with them and turn them into wards of the state.
Okay.
So if you're a slave owner, you've gone in and put a lot of your money, a lot of your capital into essentially labor, farm labor, that is bound to you, and you have title to them, like property. And if the federal government wanted to make slavery uncomfortable, it could. And the southern states are going, we have a retained right to slavery, and now the federal government is going to try to make it, you have that right. You just will wish you didn't have that right by the time we're done with you. So that's why things like expanding slavery into the territories became such a big issue, is that if you can't move slavery into the territory, even if it's viable or not, it's a big issue, because those territories not only provide an outlet for an excessive slave population, but also will bring in pro-slavery political representatives, which will help the issue at the federal level. So this retained right of the states, it's retained, but there's ways of attacking retained rights of the state without a direct frontal assault.
And the federal government got better at that over time.
Oh, it's supremely excellent at it now.
Yes.
And so a lot of people say, no, this was about slavery. You know, the Civil War is just about slavery, and that fits on a bumper sticker and a T-shirt, and everybody gets happy about it. But it was also about this recognition that a ever-expanding federal government was going to always find the workarounds to anything that limited its power. That's how come, the average Southerner owned 0 slaves.
Right.
0. Only about 1 in 4 Southerners had any sort of direct ownership or interaction with slaves. Now, they were all bound up in the slave economy, and I would argue that the northern economy was bound up in the slave economy, especially if they're in the textile industry. But that said, those 3 out of 4 understood that, hey, we're talking about an erosion of our local rights. Now, remember what I said in the previous episode, that in terms of my own personal life and how I conduct my life,
Right.
I am most comfortable with that being done at the most local level.
But that's also where the greatest potential
For
tyranny.
tyranny is, but at least it's tyranny by my friends and neighbors, and I can go ring the doorbell and say, wait a second. It's not tyranny by somebody I didn't elect in a bureaucratic position or a representative from Utah.
Right.
So that's just kind of my paleo-constitutional look at things.
No, and I think for the most part that's where the framers were. But I'm always struck in reading the Constitution that they spend a great deal of time on the rights of the national government.
Correct.
And the states' rights are dumped into the 10th Amendment.
Yeah, if we didn't think of it, it's all yours.
Yeah, so it's sort of like an add-on at the very end, and therefore not the equal of all the rights at the national government. As I go through this and looking at the Constitution line by line, our idea was that the federal government and the state government were equal in terms of rights and responsibilities. My sense after going through this is no, the framers set up a constitution that was so heavily weighted toward the national government and the powers of the national government. And the states really got hurt by this Constitution.
They gave up a bunch.
They gave up a bunch because the Articles of Confederation was a horrible.
But they gained a bunch.
Such
So
as.
then, they like protection and,
So they got a national government out of it.
Yeah, they got a national government out of it.
They had the right to tax. And,
correct. And have a rational economy, things like that. All right. So if you remove slavery
okay.
and just talk about state prerogative and resistance to federal interference in state prerogative, then all of a sudden the Civil War looks entirely different. But when you put slavery back in there, you have this sort of heartfelt natural instinct to say you can't own people. One of the things that was actually happening was that slaves were being essentially bred white.
Okay, you were going to explain that, of
the
course.
reason being is that there was so white male slave owners exercising their personal prerogative on their property.
So raping
their slaves was common enough that you had people that were enslaved that may only be 1/4, 1/8 African, African American. In New Orleans, there was a real phenomena of essentially white slaves. In fact, they had an event there called the Octoroon Ball, in which women that had a little bit of black in them, but a lot of white in them, were considered the prettiest women in New Orleans. And that was kind of the big showcase.
Okay.
All right.
Is it out of that they created the one-drop rule?
Oh, well, ultimately, you get to the one-drop rule. In the old days, one drop wasn't such a bad thing in New Orleans.
Okay.
Later on, when we get to Plessy v. Ferguson,
right,
that one-drop rule is a big deal because the emphasis now is on controlling that population politically and physically as much as they can. In the old days, they didn't have the incentive to control them in the same ways. All right. So slavery ends up becoming kind of the cast-off reason for the Civil War now in the way we understand it. But we are completely jettisoning all of this 10th Amendment stuff. And if you said, well, the Civil War is about states' rights, in today's atmosphere, you're castigated as a racist. And, well, you're ignoring the suffering of 4 million people. Well, in many ways, I guess you're setting it aside to just focus on states' rights. But by only focusing on the suffering of 4 million enslaved people in American history, you're forgetting about that very important conversation about the relationship of the federal government to the states. So there's your best 10th Amendment example, but take slaves out and put in, owning firearms, right to abortion, LGBTQ rights.
Education.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because the federal government's going to stick its fingers into education at the state level sooner or later.
Yeah, and we talked about this before. the way the federal government nowadays gets involved in the state level, transportation is
Oh,
an
yeah,
example,
absolutely.
fighting crime, we call it creeping federalism, is the federal government has money because it doesn't have to have a balanced budget. States have to have a balanced budget. And so the federal government will offer grants to the states if those states do certain things.
Absolutely.
And
They'll
so what
incentivize
happens?
them.
Yeah, exactly. They'll incentivize the states to take action that the state normally wouldn't take.
And where'd that money come from?
It came from us, the taxpayers, in the states.
In the states. So
Yes.
essentially, they're using our own money
Yes.
to control our behavior.
Yes. And by the way, we allow this. We re-elect members of Congress who pride themselves on bringing federal money to their districts.
You bet.
Okay? It's called credit claiming. Look at what I just built, this brand new interstate here.
You should elect me again.
You should
And
elect
again.
me again and again. Okay? So this creeping federalism has allowed the federal government to really, I'm struggling to find the right word, denude? Is that the right word? The 10th Amendment? Strip mine the 10th Amendment. And so that it's really hard to find where states can do things on their own and the federal government will keep their hands off.
Well, one of the trips that I've led through Bear Leader Tours was a trip that started in Philadelphia at Independence Hall and ended on Seminary Ridge at Gettysburg.
Okay.
With the broad field of Pickett's charge laying out before you.
Yeah.
And it was a bunch of school teachers I was taking up there. And I made them connect the goings-on in Independence Hall with the goings-on at Gettysburg. And they were, all of a sudden you could see the little light bulbs go on all over the place. And it doesn't matter if you were more in favor of the guys behind the stone wall on top of Cemetery Ridge or the guys emerging from the woods on Seminary Ridge. There were constitutional issues playing out there. Mm-hmm. Slavery was the particular proximate cause, but it was only the proximate cause to a much bigger question over the relationship of the federal government to the states, and whether or not the federal government could go in and encroach upon state prerogatives. And because of the way the war turned out, slaves were freed, and state prerogatives were eroded.
And it leads to a question today: why do we have states?
Yeah. What's the point of having a state?
What is the point of having Texas, or New Mexico, or California?
Well, New Mexico comes up a bunch. What's the point? And
we're just kidding.
California should be a federal district. Because they would like to rule it all, and Texas just wants to be left alone. Best I can tell.
I don't know. That's the image.
Yeah.
That's the image. Is that how they vote? Is that how they legislate? Is that how they allow the federal government to come in and do things? I mean, the reality is that if you're in the public sphere in any sort of way, you have to deal with the federal government. You have to deal with the rules and regulations of the federal government. There's no getting around it. I mean, here at a private university, we have to deal with the federal government.
We do.
It interferes with what we do. There's no getting around it.
Now, you say interfere. I was about to say, there's good and bad interference.
You go for health care. The federal government is deeply involved in health care. Where does it get the constitutional right to do that? Per the 10th Amendment, that is a state issue. But the federal government has the cash. They're the ones who fund Medicare. They're the ones who provide funding for Medicaid.
And backup student loans.
And backup student loans and, grants for research, et cetera, et cetera.
So they can almost regulate their will without having to legislate their will, which is what people in the 1850s warned was coming.
Well, they were very prophetic. And they didn't stop it. And I would argue, for good reason, I'm glad they didn't, because they would have kept slaves.
Yeah.
And that needed to be beaten out of them. I hate to say it.
Yeah, it needed to be beaten out of them. And there's bound to have been some other way for that to have happened, like compensated manumission on a national scale or something, but just wasn't. It was beat out of them.
Yeah.
They were trampling out the vintage
Yes.
where the grapes of wrath are stored.
Wow. Okay.
That's why every time you sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, you're just saying that the 10th Amendment really didn't matter.
Exactly. So does it matter today? To some people, yes. And let's go back to where we started this thing. My own state of California is using their 10th Amendment rights to push back against the federal government. They don't like some of the rules and regulations.
Late to the party.
Yeah, they don't like some of the rules and regulations coming out of the Trump administration, for example, on auto emissions or some environmental rules. And so they're pushing back, and they're saying, no, we're not going to stand for that. They've done it before. They're going to do it again. So they're just adopting a different route over different issues than what the southern states have done. And by the way, if you look at history, this has been going on all through American history. We're focusing on the big issues like slavery, for example, but it takes place all the time.
Oh, New England was all upset about, issues related to the War of 1812 to the point to where they threatened to secede.
Yeah.
A lot of people forget that it wasn't South Carolina that first raised the specter of secession. It was actually Connecticut and Massachusetts. So let the record
those
show.
radical
Those
states.
radicals up there.
Okay. So there is tension between the administrative units of the United States.
Correct.
There's no other way to say it. They argue, they fight against each other, sometimes for really good reasons.
Sometimes it's very creative tension.
Yes. And
sometimes it's destructive.
And sometimes it needs to take place with the federal government winning over the states. Other times, not so sure.
All right, so that's kind of the final word on the 10th Amendment.
Whoa.
Because we've ground this thing a long time.
Yeah.
Longer than our normal segments.
Yeah.
But
the 10th Amendment's important.
It's really important. And what got said needed to be said.
Mm-hmm.
So that ends the Bill of Rights as it came to be adopted as the Bill of Rights.
Correct.
And you're going to have to wait all the way to Amendment 27 to figure out what should have made it but didn't make it.
Right. But in the meantime, there's many more amendments to the Constitution.
There is. But the first 10, the Bill of Rights, is now done. And so what we will do next time is we will wade into amendments that I've never even thought about, like the 11th and things like that. All right, so we'll be back with another amendment next time. Thanks.